Anyone who has experienced something inexplicable, who has seen or interacted with a spirit or a fairy creature or a complete unknown, knows just how challenging it can be to share their story. G'day, I'm Kitty. Welcome to Fairy Encounters. A lot of people are reluctant to talk about their experiences openly for fear of ridicule or judgment. Many people sit on their story for years, just like I did. But I was lucky. I eventually shared my experience with someone that I trusted, and they listened and they kept an open mind. So it is that my leap of faith and his acceptance ultimately led to this YouTube channel. But for some, the only way they feel they can share their experience is anonymously. Hello, Reddit. Reddit is an international forum where people can anonymously ask questions and share their thoughts, opinions, and experiences. I know that it can be a hotbed of conflict too, and much, much worse. But for our community, it offers a safe place where we can share. In this video, I'm featuring 16 stories shared on Reddit which appeared genuine to me. I know that there are some really questionable ones out there, and I haven't included any which just didn't ring true. I'm sure we'll all have our own take on these though, so please share your thoughts on these experiences in the comments section below. Well, I really hope you enjoyed this video. Let's kick it off with this incredible story. Take a look. Yesterday, I had an extremely bizarre encounter that resulted in being gifted 25 large crystals from an individual who I believe was Fae. I'm currently helping with security at a homeless shelter because my hometown is under a severe low temperature advisory and has been opening emergency warming centres. We have people who go out and find at-risk individuals and try to get them inside, and I help with the search process for entry to the warming centre, just to make sure that nobody brings in weapons or contraband. I see all kinds of crazy stuff and unusual people, but yesterday's encounter was a whole new level. It started when the outreach staff radioed that they had found someone who was being sent in for shelter who had never been contacted before. The gentleman arrives, and immediately my gut reaction is that it would be incredibly dangerous to upset this individual. I can't explain why, but if he had knocked on my door in the middle of the night, I would be more afraid of turning him away than inviting him in. He was dressed in a dirty collection of bizarre clothes, including madras pants, a neon track jacket, and a velvet blanket tied around his shoulders with a bungee cord as a clasp. He was also a little hunched under the weight of his backpack, which seemed to be very heavy. The whole effect was that it was almost impossible to really judge his proportions, but I could see that he was wiry, and he gained a good few inches in height just by adjusting his posture. So my partner and I try to engage with him while we explain the search process and what he can and can't have in the building. At this point, we've noticed that he frequently stared off into the distance and whispered. His body movements just seemed wrong too, and became increasingly erratic as we asked him to unpack his backpack. the creepiest part was that he responded to most questions and instructions with these weird sing-song nonsense rhymes like Jackie Dupree has got set free, hee hee, and then do a little heel spin. So I start the search and immediately find a gallon Ziploc bag full of loose-leaf tobacco and a glass jar of weed. Well, I was explaining to him that the items are contraband and won't be allowed in the building, but the guy just looked at me and smiled and clicked his tongue. He grabbed the strap of his backpack and pulled it towards him on the search table, and I noticed rattling of a lot of heavy stuff in there. In that moment, I was debating whether to clear the room in case he was trying to get a weapon out. But then he pulls out a 10-inch crystal obelisk instead. At this point, myself, my partner, and the 2 other guests in the processing centre are already feeling pretty uncomfortable with this guy, and now he's pulling out giant rocks from his bag. One by one, he unloaded 18 crystal obelisks and 7 orbs and handed them to me. Then he waves at his tobacco and weed and starts humming and repeating, "This for me and those go free, hee hee." Even though it wasn't protocol for me to return substances once they'd been found, we all felt it would end really badly not to give this guy his stuff back. So he packed up and announced that he would be leaving now. I pointed out that he hadn't packed any of his rock collection back into his bag, and he just giggled, pointed at me, and said something about it being a fee to flee. Then he was making these gestures with his hand and his mouth, so I figured it meant that he wanted food. So I gave him my lunch that I had for the shift. He went nuts with excitement and then ran out of the building and into the night. One of the other guests who was in the room immediately after he left said, "You handled that smart. That man ain't right. He was like a warlock or something." I really didn't know what to do with all of the crystals, but I also felt really strongly that being disrespectful of the gift would somehow end very badly for me, so I packed them all up and brought them home. We also realised later, after the fact, that at no point during his processing did he ever provide an actual name. So my question is, does this sound like Fae behaviour? Because so much of his behaviour that night was just otherworldly. So I once saw an older man at an ice cream shop wearing a gorgeous velvet blazer. The velvet was the most beautiful fabric. I just couldn't take my eyes away from it. And this man was enjoying his ice cream with a childlike joy too. It made me happy just to see him happy. His joy was incredible, but he couldn't see me looking at him as I was a little behind him. Then suddenly I realised the detailing on his jacket was really fine and old-fashioned. It looked like something from the legit Victorian era, yet the fabric looked brand new. I mean, this blazer belonged in a museum. Still standing behind him, I realised that he had balls of dust or something like that behind his ears, like he hadn't showered in God knows how long, but his overall appearance was very clean and well dressed. So he didn't look homeless to me. He had a round face He looked a little like a kindly shopkeeper from a British kid's story, something like that. Suddenly, I started feeling like something was off about him, and I just couldn't put my finger on it. And at the same time, he suddenly got startled, and then he slowly and intently started scanning the line of maybe a dozen people waiting to order their ice cream. The line moved at this point, and I was looking to a side, but I could still see him in my side vision. As all New Yorkers, I have a gift of looking without staring. So he was scanning the room, and when he got to me, he started giggling. Then he turned away a little and kept glancing back and giggling at me. It was about noon, I think, then. I was in this crowded place with my boyfriend, and I just suddenly got overwhelmed with this strong urge just to get out of that store. It felt like a panic attack. So I asked my boyfriend if we could just go, and to my surprise, he said yes. I think they have an ability to mentally spook humans who become aware of them, as it's said that they can't interact with us unless it's for a special purpose. Well, anyway, the whole experience was really strange. I'm still fascinated by that blazer. Maybe I'm just crazy. Oh, and this was before I even heard of any of this fairy lore. And yet, at the time, I almost immediately had a knowing that he was otherworldly. When I was around 8 years old, I went to my grandparents' house for my very first solo sleepover. I remember really clearly playing in their guest room and always having my attention drawn to a specific corner of that room. Anyway, that evening I went to bed and I slept soundly. I woke up right around dawn, and I can remember clear as day seeing a small humanoid figure walking across the windowsill of the window which was facing east. I remember the dawn light creating a sort of silhouetted image of this thing, but I could tell that it was wearing clothing, and from the waist down it had a sort of transparent look about it. As it neared the end of the windowsill, I can remember it noticing me watching it, and it quickly hopped off the sill into the dark corner of the room, the corner that always seemed to draw my attention. Well, a few years ago, I was visiting my mother and I brought it up. She said she vividly remembers picking me up that morning, and that I was so scared out of my wits, it was to the point where I refused to even enter that room to gather my toys. I've run this encounter through my head more times than I can count, just trying my best to dismiss it as a childhood dream. But 30 years later, that memory still sticks out in my mind as clear as day. My great-grandmother was in her early 20s, living in the town of Miles in Australia. Late one night, she went to collect her sister from the public transport depot. Her sister worked at a hospital out of town and frequently returned home late. On this particular evening, as my great-grandmother walked towards the station, she spotted a small group of 5 or so men standing huddled in a circle, as if they were looking at something on the ground. When she came closer, she realized that all of these men were bald, pale, and roughly the same height. They were dressed similarly too, and didn't acknowledge her at all as she passed. She felt uneasy, but continued walking so that her sister wouldn't have to pass the group alone. What she saw further up the road stopped her. Another 2 groups of the same type of men. She thought that they might be part of a tour bus group, but as she continued her walk, she didn't see a bus. En route to the station, she passed several more small groups of identical men spaced out along the road. She soon frightened herself enough to break into a run, and when she arrived at the depot, her sister was there waiting. Without explaining anything, she dragged her sister toward where she saw the men, only to find the street completely empty. My great-grandmother told my grandmother this story in confidence very late in her life. She never mentioned it to her sister that night or to anyone else for fear of people thinking she was crazy. She wasn't a woman prone to superstition or storytelling, so it intrigued me when my grandmother told the story to me. I looked online for similar occurrences but couldn't find a match anywhere, so I thought I'd share it here, and that way her story will live on. When I was a child, about 6, I would often hear a banging or creaking or even a bell that would wake me from my sleep. I would hear a voice in my head telling me to go downstairs to meet them. When I would arrive downstairs to my kitchen/back door area, my memory is a bit fuzzy on what it looked like, I would see a very tall and slender female-looking thing that wasn't quite human. I remember there being some blue or black features, but when I try to picture it in my head, it seems monstrous. I get scared and give up because I don't think I want to remember. Anyway, at the time, I don't remember feeling fear, but I don't think I understood what was happening. I would take its hand and walk outside, and after that, everything is blank. It may have given me gifts, like rocks and stuff like that. I probably still have, but I can't remember. I think that's where I got my obsession with collecting rocks and crystals and being really good at finding cool stuff in the dirt, because maybe it showed me how. I don't know. I'm just guessing at that because my memory is fuzzy. It probably messed with my memory, but it happened a lot for a few years, probably a few times a week or over 2 weeks. Then it just stopped as I aged, and I grew fearful of those memories because ever since I always feel like I'm being watched or I'm not alone. For a long time I thought I was just being paranoid, but then I started looking into the Fae folklore. Once I learned enough, I got chills down my spine and realized what I was dealing with. I try to put it out of my mind and just live my life, but I still get really scared and chills when I think about it or talk about it. The house I lived in was over 150 years old, and other strange things would happen there too, like things moving on their own or going missing and appearing later on in odd places. Still, to this day, anywhere I move, strange things happen. My mum would always tell me to just be respectful and cautious with the supernatural, and then it won't hurt you, she'd say. I probably won't be sleeping well tonight now that I've shared this and remembered for a brief time. I only tell people I trust or anonymously online. Sometimes I wonder if it was a dream, but it happens so often, and I would wake up with dirty feet the next day. And once, my mum caught me coming back inside in the middle of the night, and I had no explanation for her. Pretty sure it would either tell me not to tell or make me forget briefly so I would go back to sleep right away. But in the mornings, I would always remember some of it. I don't know if it's related, but I have really bad luck, but in a good way. Like, a lot goes wrong in my life all the time, but always ends up being okay in the end without having much intervention by myself. As an adult, every few years I have these weird night terrors about being taken away. I lived way out in a rural small town next to a forest and a lake, and I like going in the woods, and I still do, but I always feel a bit scared, especially when it starts to get dark. But it's a weird kind of peaceful fear, and it's kind of enjoyable. I don't know, it's all strange and confusing. I can't pinpoint what kind of fae it was or what they wanted from me, because I get so scared when I think about it that I give up and I try to forget all over again. This happened to my sister and my nephew, so I know it's true, as they both shared the same story to me separately. I'm from Puerto Rico. We have a lot of rivers all over the island, and sometimes we go and take the family and enjoy the day swimming and just having fun at a certain location. So this particular day, my sister went out with her partner and my nephews. They were having a great day, and then my sister realised that she needed something that was in her vehicle that was parked on the main road. So her eldest son went with her, and he got ahead of her and got into the vehicle to get what she wanted. So she keeps walking towards him, right? And all of a sudden, she said she felt weird and froze. She doesn't know if she was being forced to be still or if she stopped of her own free will. But there she was, standing still on the road, just analysing and trying to make sense of what was going on. She said there was a weird smell. I asked her if it was a bad or repulsive smell, and she said it wasn't, that it was more like a sweet smell, different but not bad. She also said that she was looking around and trying to make sense of what was going on in the surroundings. She was still on the same road, but it felt different somehow, and she kept hearing these buzzing sounds and seeing these flashes or shadows moving real fast around her. And then something stopped in front of her. The thing stopped and let her see it. She described it as a fairy, Walt Disney-like, she said, but not as beautiful. She said it wasn't heinous or ugly looking, but it wasn't pretty either. And it wasn't really small. This thing was there in front of her for a few seconds, and then it went back to whatever it was doing. It was then that she looked at her son, and he was still a ways away from her, and he screamed at her, "Mum, are you seeing what I'm seeing?" She told him yes, and that was when they realised that they were gone. Then they went back to the river and resumed their day as if nothing had happened. She told me about it the next day, and she said she had discussed it briefly with her son, but that they didn't talk about it in detail. She said it just sort of faded. I was living in an apartment with my girlfriend at the time, and one night she was looking for the baking soda she used to scrub her face with. Now, it was always in the same spot on a shelf in the bathroom, and we looked at that spot, but the space for the small box was on the shelf, but there was no baking soda. Well, I was standing in the doorway to the bathroom, confused as she opened the medicine cabinet above the sink to check inside, but no dice. But as soon as she closed the cabinet door, I saw the baking soda back in the space on the shelf we had just checked. She freaked out. She thought it was ghosts, but I knew better because ghosts don't normally play little pranks. So I spoke loudly throughout the apartment saying, "Welcome to our home, make yourself at home," etc., etc. I had actually just picked some fresh peppers from my mother's garden and had them in a bowl in the kitchen, and I said, "Please help yourself to a pepper fresh from the garden if you'd like." And after that we went to bed. The next morning my girlfriend got up and shrieked, saying to stop messing with her. So I immediately sprung up from bed to see what was going on. A single pepper had been removed from the bowl and sat away from it on the counter near the windowsill. Now I was absolutely sure it was fairies of some sort. Over the coming months we had more encounters too, like our dog would go under the coffee table with his tail sticking out, and he would make these weird growl noises that had the rhythm of talking. Under that table was the only place he ever made those sounds. My particular favourite, though, was this 4-leaf clover that sprouted out of a crack in the wall in the shower. When I was like 5 or 6, I lived across the street from my friend's backyard, so I would always sneak in through a wooden door into her garden. The garden was massively overgrown with a giant hedge of sorts on one side, with things like abandoned chairs and a bathtub inside it, which we'd play in, and on the other side an unruly hedge which separated the property from its neighbouring one. One day we were playing by the latter hedge, and we both looked up and saw this thing floating in front of us. To us, it looked like a small person made of honeysuckle with these flower stem looking limbs. I saw a fae while walking on the ridgeway near Beacon Hill, which has a very strong magical presence of its own. I was walking with my dad along the path with thick woods on each side. I saw a little clearing a bit back in the woods, brightly lit by a sunbeam. We were walking fast, so I could only see the clearing for a half second or so at a time, until it was blocked for another fraction of a second by a tree. I noticed a rather large black cat sitting on a flat rock in the clearing. It was there as I passed several trees, and once I figured out that it seemed out of place, it disappeared, and a tall figure stood in its place. I think it was a woman, but I'm not completely sure. They were standing with their left side facing me, wearing a long green robe hemmed in gold with long chestnut hair. They were there for just a blink of an eye until I had passed another tree, by which time both the figure and the cat were gone. I had this sudden intuition that I should just ignore it and keep walking. And that's precisely what I did. And that was my only sighting of a fae. I'd stopped at a red light on an intersection when I noticed what I thought was a white feather moving along the road surface. It struck me as strange that this feather was upright. It had a slight curve and was maybe 4 to 5 centimetres tall, and it was travelling in a straight line. It didn't flutter like a feather in the wind would, and the curve was always to the front. I watched it as it travelled across 2 lanes, and on the 3rd lane it was passed by fast-moving cars. So I expected it to react to the turbulence, but it just continued straight. And when it got to the edge of the lane, another almost identical feather, if that's what it was, passed it going in the opposite direction. Both were in contact with the road, about 15 to 20 centimetres apart, going in opposite directions, before the first one shot into the air, did 2 loop-the-loops as I watched, and then flew out of sight. All I could think was that I had just seen 2 fairy folk. I parked at my boyfriend's apartment building, which is surrounded by heavy woods, and I've long suspected that there are fae in there. One night when I pulled the car in, something happened. It was as if squirrels were throwing acorns at my car, but there were no squirrels up in the trees that I could see. The noise they were making was loud, and I couldn't pretend that I hadn't heard it or seen it, so I got out of the car and I left an offering of a symbol made with twigs and some weeds, just so they would know that I was acknowledging them. My car was towed from the car park that night, and it cost me $200 to get it back. My boyfriend paid for half. The next time I went back, I asked the fae why they would do that, because I had honoured them. So I began to play beautiful sounding music for them every time I visited, and I did this for about 3 weeks. Then one day I parked my car up at my boyfriend's apartment building as usual. I hopped out of the car, looked down at the ground, and there on the grass was $125 in cash, all rolled up and messy. So that's my fairy interaction. I wish I could see them, but I haven't yet. But I definitely feel their presence at times. I knew a woman who lived in an apartment that was situated near a stream or a brook. One evening, she looked out of her window and, in the distance, saw a strange woman with ankle-length hair that was standing by the stream. Despite her distance, the strange woman lifted her face and stared directly at her, and then proceeded to smile, a very wide, very evil smile. When I moved into my current house, my hammer disappeared. The logical conclusion was that it had ended up in one of the boxes. Well, I had a second hammer in my toolbox, so I used that, and then it also disappeared. I searched all over. I got so frustrated that I ended up going out and buying a brand new hammer. Now, there is a saying, once is an anomaly, twice is a coincidence, 3 times is a pattern. And sure enough, that 3rd hammer went missing as well. About that same time, I was seeing a blur out of the corner of my eye, a figure about a foot to a yard tall, brown with a light brown vest. It was never still enough to see details, and it was always gone right after I'd noticed it. So I did a little Googling and I discovered that fey brownies fit the description and the behaviour of this. It seems it didn't like that I was banging and hammering nails for pictures. So I got some nuts, honey and raisins and set out an offering and stated that I was new here and I want to be a good neighbour. I found all 3 hammers the next day. One night I lay down to go to sleep in my bedroom, which had no windows, by the way, because it was an extra room off the family room. I went to college in the afternoons, so taking that room as my bedroom made it easier to sleep. I did have a blue nightlight so that I wouldn't trip or fall getting up, going to the bathroom, etc. I had a bed frame with lights though, so I could turn them on without getting out of bed normally. Anyway, I had just put my head on the pillow when 2 red orbs came into the room, right through the wall from the family room. They seemed to be flying in formation. I'm nearsighted, so they just looked like red orb lights to me. And by the way, the night light I have is blue, not red. The weird thing is, one of them seemed to notice me tracking it, flying across the room, as it suddenly flew right over to me, right up in front of my face where I could see it clearly. It wasn't really an orb shape at all. It looked like a sort of pixie, about 3 or 4 inches tall. The orb effect I'd seen was just kind of a radiance from around its body, possibly only looking like that due to my poor vision. Its body looked the colour of fire, with shades of red and possibly hints of orange moving around a bit. It probably looked at me for 6 or 7 seconds. I stared at it intently, wondering what on earth I was seeing. I could just make out a head/face, but the features were too hard to tell as there were only slight colour variations between it and the rest of the body shape. I got a female impression for some odd reason, but that could have just been my imagination. Then, just as I noticed its head distinctly from the rest of its torso, it moved it like it was cocking its head to the side. My impression was, how can you see me, in an inquisitive type manner, like it was testing me to see if I could really see it by flying up to me. It seemed like when it realised I could see it, either it thought better of staying there or just lost interest, because suddenly it flew off through the far wall to the backyard. I mean, under the backyard. The surface level was 1/3 of the room approximately, so it really flew under the backyard. The idea of a fairy mound came to mind, even though I didn't see a mound, but there were a lot of trees in that yard. The next night, another one flew through the room shortly after I went to bed, but it didn't stop and it just went through the back wall again. And that was it. I never saw one at that house again. I was walking home one night and instinctively turned to walk the long way home. And then I turned back again thinking, this is crazy, just walk the short way. So I did. Then I found myself really struggling to walk for about 100 meters. Now this was a walk that I had done with no issue for years and years. It was an easy walk, a flat surface, but I felt like I was carrying an impossible weight. It was so difficult. After I'd crossed the bridge, which was over a stream, I got to the end of the road and the feeling was gone. This huge weight was lifted and I felt normal again. I've been told since that I gave a piggyback to a fairy that night. They say, that some fairies can't walk over running water. I've not gone down that road unless it's absolutely necessary since. There's no weird feeling to it, but I just avoid walking it. This happened years ago when I was about 18. I was taking a long hot bath in the middle of a winter day, more to relax than anything else. The bathroom was set up so that while laying back in the tub, the toilet was about 5 feet directly across from my head. There was this potted plant on top of the toilet tank, and while I lay there relaxing, I suddenly noticed that there was a tiny, bright, golden white light fluttering in the plant. It looked like it was going from leaf to leaf, stopping to rest sometimes. I was confused as to what it could be and just lay there watching it for a minute. Then I decided to get up and see what kind of insect would be doing this in the wintertime. I stood up from the tub really quietly and crept over to the plant. When I was about a foot away, the light just went out, like instantaneously disappeared. I searched all over the plant, and it wasn't a large plant, and around the toilet, and I didn't find anything. I have no idea what it was, but that light was a beautiful, clear, gold white colour that I haven't seen anywhere else. It wasn't the glow stick like greeny yellow that fireflies or glowworms have. Also, it didn't flicker or fly like a firefly, assuming, of course, that a full-grown one could even be found in the winter. I guess it could have been a lot of things, but it's always seemed fairy-like to me. I hope you enjoyed this eclectic collection of stories from people all over the world. They are a reminder that the creatures we call fairies can appear almost anywhere, in many shapes and sizes, behaviours and intentions. If you enjoy my videos, please consider buying me a coffee. It's quick and easy. The link is in the notes below. I'd really appreciate your support. We're changing the channel up a little bit. Have you noticed? And we'll be releasing a new longer format video every second week now. So please check that you've tickled that notifications bell, and that way YouTube will give you a heads up when our next video is released. Until then, stay curious. Cheerio!